Today I'm going to show you how to cook a steak in a cast iron skillet on top of the stove for a quick and easy carnivore dinner. I stopped at the grocery store on my way home and I picked up a pack of these boneless ribeyes that are on sale this week. And this one is about an inch thick. One of my biggest tips is to let meat sit out and come to room temperature before you cook it so that it cooks evenly. I don't really have a lot of time tonight. And while that's still important, because it is not a super thick steak, it's not as important for it to sit out a long time. So while I kind of get settled from work, I pulled it out of that plastic and styrofoam from the grocery store pack. I'm just gonna let it sit on a paper plate on a cooling rack on the counter, change my clothes, pack my daughter's lunch for school tomorrow, and then we'll start cooking. First thing I wanna do is show you the things that I'm gonna use to cook this steak. If you've watched my other videos, you know how obsessed I am with adobo and smoked paprika. We cannot use these with this type of steak. The heat and the cast iron would burn and your steak would end up tasting like burnt garlic. The only seasoning we're gonna use on this cast iron is some good thick coarse salt. I have tongs to flip it. I have some ghee, which is a clarified butter that has a high smoke point so it's not gonna burn or end up giving us a funky taste as we cook with high heat. And then because butter is delicious and helps create a nice crust on things, I'm gonna spoon over some butter at the last minute and I'll show you what that looks like. Of course, you need a cast iron skillet. If you don't have one, you could use a regular skillet, but it's not gonna cook as evenly as it would with the cast iron. I would recommend just picking one up. You can get one for pretty cheap at Walmart or Amazon. We do have a cooling rack. We're gonna let the meat sit out here and rest at the end. I like to let it come to room temperature by sitting on this plate on top. It just helps the air circulate and maybe come to room temperature a little faster. Lastly, it's not a bad idea to have a meat thermometer standing by. The thinner the steak, the harder it is to actually use a meat thermometer, but to get an accurate reading. But in this case, I do like to have one standing by just for reference. One more thing I want to mention, if your steak is thicker than this, over an inch thick, you would need to do a reverse sear method, and that video is coming soon. Today, this is for steaks that are a little thinner, or if you liked it pretty rare, you could do a thicker steak just on the stove. I am ready to cook this in the cast iron. So first thing I'm gonna do is turn the stove on to high and give it several minutes to heat up. Really, you're gonna watch and I'll show you what it looks like. It's gonna start smoking in a little bit when it's time to cook. We're waiting for that cast iron to heat evenly all the way through. While that's heating up, I'm gonna season my steak. I have that thick coarse salt and I'm gonna sprinkle it on top of the meat. I'm gonna use a liberal amount and I'm gonna push it in because as I'm cooking it, a lot of it is gonna fall out. So don't be afraid to really salt it and push it down in there. Make sure you get both sides. See, some's already fallen out. So don't be afraid of how much salt it looks like. The pan is gonna feel warm right away, but see this little bit of smoke coming off of it? That's what we wanna wait for. This took about 4 to 5 minutes before it was nice and hot. Now we're gonna put our ghee in. You really can't use too much ghee. I'm gonna put 2 big tablespoons in here. This is also a really big cast iron skillet. You would need less if your skillet was smaller, but don't be afraid of too much. We wanna let it melt and see how it's getting nice and shimmery and smoky. That's great. We want the ghee to warm up so we're not cooling down the pan before we put our steak in. Your ghee's melted, but I'm still gonna wait. We wanna make sure that ghee is nice and hot so we don't ruin the crust on our steak. Now we're seeing that steam starting to come up. So I'm gonna put my steak on nice and flat and push out all those air bubbles as I'm pushing it on. We're gonna give it a good stick down to make sure that there's no air bubbles underneath. And now we're not gonna touch it for about 2 to 3 minutes, depending on the thickness of your steak. Also, if you don't have a good exhaust fan or if you're trying to film at the same time, your house is gonna get really smoky. After about 2 to 3 minutes, we're gonna go ahead and lift it up and This pan is a little uneven, so I'm gonna get some new ghee underneath of there just to keep it hot. And then as I put it on, you can see it splatter a little more. I'm gonna press it back down again just to make sure it's making good contact all the way across. This steak has been going for about 4 minutes. It would be less depending on the thickness. We're gonna flip it. Press it back down again. Pretty quickly, we're gonna get our butter and put our butter in the side, and we're gonna start basting it with butter. We're gonna let the butter melt. We're not afraid of brown butter. We don't want black burnt butter, but brown butter is what's gonna make it taste good. Once that butter's melted, we're gonna start basting our steak. We're gonna do this basting motion over and over again for about 30 seconds to a minute. Pretty non-stop. Even though this pan is not against the heat anymore, it's still holding lots of heat because of the metal. After about 30 seconds, I'm gonna flip the steak over, and we're gonna baste it on the other side. Basting it on that second side is what's giving it that good crust over there. Try not to splash it everywhere like I'm doing. I'm gonna flip it back over and use my meat thermometer as a reference. We're sitting at medium rare right now, so I'm gonna give it 1 more minute. I personally am looking for about 130. We're sitting right exactly at 130, so we're gonna pull it off and let it rest. For a good 5 minutes, and don't touch it. We're gonna turn off our stove and make sure you take your cast iron off. This handle is long, but it's getting really hot, so make sure you protect your hands too. It's been resting for about 5 minutes. Let's see how it turned out. That looks pretty perfect to me. I like to add a little more coarse salt just for my personal preference because I like that crunch when I'm eating, but looks delicious. Thanks so much for watching. I hope this video gives you some confidence in cooking a steak on a cast iron skillet. Make sure you subscribe because next time we're gonna be doing a reverse sear method for when you have a thick steak or a tri-tip that you wanna cook.